Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to see so many faces here today, and I would like to warmly welcome you to the second of three in our Goodman series, for the Goodman Lecture Series. But before we begin, I'd like to tell you a bit about the series. Western University is very, very proud to host this endowed speaker series. It started in 1975 under tragic circumstances when the family of Edwin A. Goodman lost their eldest daughter, Joanne Goodman, in a tragic car accident. But out of this tragedy came the Goodman Lectures. And by 1976, this endowed series, through the generosity of the family, was able to come to Western. And since then, I argue that this is, without doubt, the most distinguished history speaker series in Canada. And the list of distinguished historians that we've had have certainly shown that to be true. It's a series that speaks to the history of the transatlantic triangle. So each year we alternate between a distinguished Canadian historian, American historian, and British historian. This year, we are very fortunate and honored to have with us really one of the biggest names, one of the most well-known names in Canadian history, Charlotte Gray. Charlotte Gray comes to us originally from Sheffield, England, where she had a career as a journalist, but she came to Canada in 1979, and since then she has gone on, as she talked about in yesterday's lecture, to, in essence, I think, become our next Pierre Burton. Her list of publications are long, and any academic historian salivates at the thought of being able to write 10 books in a career, and this is 10 books in a career that is far from being done. She is a biographer, and she focuses on the power of personality in Canadian history, and she's written books of some of our most well-known and what used to be least known important women. So she's written histories of people like Susanna Moody and Catherine Parr and E. Pauline Johnson, just to name a few. So we are very fortunate today to have her come and to give us a second in a third or in a three lecture series. Yesterday, she spoke to us on selling history, education, or entertainment. And I was particularly impressed because Charlotte dove straight into an issue that is on a lot of people's minds when she's giving these talks, and that's the contested terrain between public history and academic history. And as Charlotte pointed out yesterday, there's this situation where, to an extent, I think popular historians have a bit of envy for academic historians due to our titles and our university affiliations and our prestige. But that's about it. And we, on the other hand, are envious of the fact that she writes books, so many books, that people will actually read. And so her name becomes so well known. And so I was impressed by the fact that she dove straight into that topic and into that terrain, and in a sense gave us a history of popular history in Canada. Today, she's going to give us a talk on putting it on screen. And so without further ado, I would like you to warmly welcome Charlotte Gray.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that great introduction. And also, I'd like to say thank you for coming today and being part of this afternoon's history talk. And I'm not sure if it's education or entertainment, but I hope you're going to enjoy it. So, history on screen. In 1915, the American director D.W. Griffiths launched his epic movie, Birth of a Nation. Griffiths' 3-hour silent historical drama covered the US Civil War and period of Reconstruction, treating it with what today is recognized as astonishing and offensive inaccuracy. The film's publicist screened Birth of a Nation at the White House for US President Woodrow Wilson, the political science professor who served as president of Princeton University. Immediately afterwards, the publicist claimed that the president pronounced the film to be better history than many of the books written by his academic colleagues. President Wilson, alleged the spin doctor, had praised the movie as, quote, like writing history with lightning. The president protested that he had never said that. In fact, he described Birth of a Nation as a, quote, unfortunate production. His words were lost. Birth of a Nation grossed $10 million, a box office smash in those days, and histories of film continue to assert that Wilson described the movie as writing history with lightning. The movie demonstrated the dangers of history as entertainment. It picked up on the ugly, racist attitudes in early 20th century America, attitudes shared by the president himself, and then exacerbated them. It celebrated the South as a citadel of chivalry, caricatured African Americans, and contributed to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia that same year. It was a very particular version of the mythology, a Birth of a Nation narrative. So why did I begin this afternoon's lecture with Griffiths' Birth of a Nation, an appalling American production made over a century ago? Because some things never change. Griffiths' title made large claims about its subject. It demonstrated the reach of screen imagery, its potential for distortion. And it launched what Dr. John Hurd Thompson, professor of history at Duke University, and an advisor on one of the Canadian history series that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, has called, quote, the enduring battle between academic and cinematic history. So yesterday, I talked about the sometimes uncomfortable relationships between university-based historians and writers of popular history books. Today, I'm going to tackle another difficult relationship, the relationship between producers of written history and producers of history on screen. The past has always been a rich source of subject matter for dramas, documentaries, or the intermediate docudramas, but history on screen is even more deeply enmeshed in contemporary concerns than popular history on the page. And in this country, screen histories have deliberately tried to construct national mythologies. The shift of popular history from the page to new media, not just television and movies, but now YouTube and other internet-based media, is endlessly explored by scholars in communication studies and popular culture. As Dirk Eitzen, an American documentary maker and professor of film media studies, suggests, quote, popular audiences of historical documentaries are not particularly interested in either the complexity of the past or in explaining it. What they want more than anything is a powerful emotional experience. Producers are looking for a story that will trigger excitement and empathy. Successful screen projects take viewers inside the action as it unfolds and follow a linear formula. Events have outcomes, and identifiable, usually fascinating individuals drive the action. Practitioners of the art are equally interested and blunter about their needs. Screenwriters, directors, and producers of history movies and television programs mine the work of history scholars for their raw material. However, the words, "this feels like a history lesson," are anathema. In contrast, history scholars have spent far less time within their literature debating the shift to screen within their discipline. Most historians simply shrug, exasperated by television's obsession with, quote, the story, because it doesn't bother much with questions about sources, methods, or interpretation. In this view, history on screen is history light, in which anecdote trumps evidence, individuals overshadow groups, and nobody had dental problems. Most university-based historians consider the medium too impressionistic, too interested in linear narrative. British historian Sir Ian Kershaw recognizes that, quote, while it is unquestionably powerful, it is of necessity superficial. But as D.W. Griffiths' Birth of a Nation proved, it can be a formidable influence on public opinion. After the unification of Italy in 1871, the Piedmontese statesman D'Azeglio wrote, "We have made Italy, and now we must make Italians." The three Canadian series that I'm going to discuss this afternoon, all in their own ways, attempt to do the same for Canada, a version of the Birth of a Nation narrative. In a fragmented country like Canada, the construction of a national mythology has been a tough assignment. What can bind together a country with three different founding groups, festering regional tensions, a rapidly changing population, and a painful shortage of traditions? A country that historian J.M.S. Careless tagged with being a society of, quote, limited identities, and more recently historian Ramsay Cook described as a state without a nation. Every Canadian cultural group, region, and political movement seems to have its own preferred reading of the past that both complements and contests the others. It often appears that Canadians have no shared experience, history, or cultural identity, only shared grudges against, for example, Toronto, Air Canada, or the CBC. This is a shallow foundation on which to build nation-building television programs. Lack of an imagined community spawns another problem. Elsewhere, individuals, usually experts with immaculate academic qualifications, have been on-camera narrators for historical documentaries or docudramas. In recent years, British viewers have enjoyed Simon Sharma's 15-part BBC series, A History of Britain, from the year 2000. David Starkey's 2004-2007 series, Monarchy. Neil Ferguson's 2011 six-part documentary series, Civilization, Is the West History? These teledons communicate gravitas, knowledge, and passion, and really connect with their audiences. Their programs have been enjoyed here and in the US, as well as in Britain. The same audiences have also been treated to the American Experience documentaries, such as the Civil War, Jazz, the Roosevelts, and now Vietnam, directed and produced by Ken Burns. Burns uses well-respected pundits such as Doris Kearns Goodwin and George Will as talking heads, plus voiceovers by Hollywood heavyweights including Jason Robards, Morgan Freeman, Meryl Streep. The Burns formula consists of long panning shots over archival photos, extensive reliance on primary sources, and an elegiac nostalgia for collective American experiences with a redemptive ending. In a recent New Yorker interview, Burns described his work as emotional archaeology. He deplored the way that academic historians had been drawn into, quote, semiotics and symbolism and deconstruction and postmodernism and queer studies and African American studies and feminism. He insisted he had always intuitively included all those viewpoints into his work, and instead had striven to bring all viewers into the story he tells. But in Canada, such devices are difficult for programs hoping to attract mass audiences. In a country with no clear sense of identity, no individual is likely to pass unchallenged as either a teledon or a celebrity host. Which Canadian expert today can transcend the national anti-elitism? Who could possibly be the representative Canadian everyman, let alone every woman? In a country that prides itself on pluralism, every accent carries its own baggage of stereotypes. Ukrainian Canadians in Alberta are unlikely to welcome a Maritimer telling their history. Newfoundlanders wouldn't trust a come from away, and it's risky today for anybody to pronounce on either French Canadian or Indigenous history unless they are members of those communities. Over the past 60 years, the National Film Board of Canada has produced over 13,000 films, many of which had Canadian history as their focus. Most of them are freely available these days on digital platforms, especially YouTube, but you have to know what you're looking for. This afternoon, I'm not trawling through YouTube. Instead, I'm looking at 3 recent series about Canadian history that was made specifically for an audience that, as we endlessly repeat to each other, knows extraordinarily little about this country's past and is only a click away from changing the channel. The series were important because they fostered debate, especially in English Canada, about who we are and how we got here. This is what good popular history in this country can do. But there were big differences between the image of Canada and Canadians that each promoted. The first major attempt to capture a wide audience for Canadian history that I wish to discuss was the series of Heritage Minutes, which began to appear on screen, mainly television screens, in 1991, and last year celebrated 25 years of existence. There are more than 80 minutes available today. They originated within, for Canada, an unlikely source, the private sector. In 1981, Montrealer Charles Bronfman, an heir to the Seagram Empire, was inducted into the Order of Canada. As he sat in the Government House ceremony, he listened to the citations of his fellow inductees and was amazed. He heard individual stories of bravery, scientific discovery, kindness, and athletic achievement, and felt that far more people should hear them. More particularly, he understood that Canadians were ignorant of not only tales of contemporary achievements, but also tales of past achievements, and many had, like him, been bored by the history he was taught in school. Public opinion polling revealed that most Canadian high school and college graduates could not name a Canadian from the past that they admired, let alone complete a simple history test. As Bronfman put it in his memoir, Distilled, published last year, quote, "We didn't know our heroes or heroines. These are the things that make a successful society, make its people proud, and fortify the fabric of a nation." So straightforward nationalism was built into the DNA of the Heritage Minutes. The impulse was to construct collective memories. The project was intended to give all Canadians a common base of stories as a way to bind them together. In 1986, Bronfman established the Crb Foundation with an endowment of $100 million and built an impressive team to tackle the task. Tom Axworthy, former Principal Secretary to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, led the effort to design a means, in Bronfman's words, to tell stories, quote, "in an absorbing, engaging way as a means of enhancing Canadianism or Canadian heritage." The team explored, among other models, the format of the bicentennial minutes that were shown on American television stations in 1976, and the techniques of Sesame Street. They settled on the idea of 60-second mini-redemptive narratives. If Canadians could be persuaded in 60 seconds of television to buy cornflakes, Cadillacs, or tampons, couldn't they be similarly sold on the idea that Canadian history was interesting and something to be proud of? Each of the first Heritage Minutes cost between $150,000 and $250,000 and rivaled music videos in production values. This means that the total cost of the first few seasons was over $14 million. The Heritage Minutes were commercials not so much for Canadian history as for a specific idea of Canada that was threatened. History was the means, not the end. In an early internal document, Axworthy had argued that the minutes should, quote, "preserve and enhance a tolerant, open, productive, and sharing Canada, bilingual in language but multicultural in character." This was the Trudeau Liberal vision of modern Canada, a marked contrast to earlier versions of Canada captured in national narratives by university-based historians. Traditional Anglophone historians like Donald Creighton had described the Dominion of Canada as a former British colony that included a Francophone component. Quebec historians, such as Lionel Groux, had depicted Francophone history as a struggle for survival against Indigenous, Anglophone, and American forces. But by 1986, more than a quarter of Canada's population was neither British nor French in origin, and Quebec nationalism was creating national insecurity. So the minutes were designed to shape a new kind of inclusive trans-Canada identity. Significantly, each minute would be produced in both English and French. The first minute aired in 1991. The mini-dramas, which promised to, quote, give our past a future, proved popular with broadcasters who in the early 1990s were suffering from an advertising slump. CBC and CTV welcomed free content that qualified under a CRTC ruling as Canadian content. In 1992, the minutes filled 8 hours per month of airtime. By September the following year, that number had risen to 9.5 hours per month. By 1998, Heritage Minutes were filling 46 hours per month of Canadian airtime and were regularly shown in Cineplex theatres. Dr. John Hurd Thompson, then Professor of Canadian History at McGill University and a friend of Axworthy since graduate school, and Dr. Jean-Claude Robert, Professor of History at the University of Quebec at Montreal, were consultants on the project. In the early years, the minutes focused on individual achievements, and the viewer was left with the first, an implicit message about the larger benefit achieved by the hero, and second, the explicit tagline, part of our heritage. The first 3 minutes dealt with the Underground Railroad, 3 First World War heroes from Winnipeg, and the plant hockey mask. I think that one's the plant hockey mask, isn't it? Yes. Other minutes dealt with a series of Canadian identifiers, among them northernness and survival, proximity to the United States, French-English colonial past, regionalism, the contrast between Canadian collective efforts versus the macho individualism of Americans. By the third season, the minutes had gone beyond individual achievements and were dealing with more abstract concepts, including representative government, peacekeeping, and healthcare. It was an idealized past. Until last year, few minutes dealt with unsavory episodes from the past: anti-immigration bigotry, ecological disasters, separatism, Western alienation, internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. A handful of minutes dealt with Indigenous history, including a powerful one about Tommy Prince, a World War I Indigenous hero who faced appalling discrimination on his return. And several minutes dealt with the discrimination faced by women in our history. Nevertheless, the general tone was uplifting, as you can see in this Heritage Minute about Sir Sandford Fleming.
He surveyed and engineered 4 Canadian railroads and transformed the world with standard time. Senator Fleming, engineer.
In the words of cultural historian Erin Peters, this minute emphasizes Canadians' ability to maintain a unified nation despite the geographical boundaries of space and place. The Canada that emerges from those early minutes patchwork is an optimistic, wholesome country characterized by responsible government, compromise, internationalist aspirations, and really nice people. Patrick Watson, creative director and principal writer of the series, explicitly noted, "We're not really doing documentary here, we're making myths." Once Canadians had learnt to filter the past through this nationalist mythology, they would be motivated to read their documentary history as a grand narrative of survival and achievement. Reviewers and scholars were sharply critical. Columnist Robert Fulford described the minutes as, quote, "driblets of history with stunningly obvious messages." Dr. Elspeth Cameron suggested they were a, quote, "a vitamin pill notion of history, sugar-coated, concentrated, easy to swallow, and good for the health of the nation." The past, she argued, was being defined through the current need to produce a set of collective memories that answered contemporary concerns, including gun control, women's rights, and most important within the context of the 1990s, constitutional clashes, national unity. Professor Timothy Stanley at the University of Ottawa points out that the minutes were so busy creating the myth of Canadian tolerance that they re-racialized and excluded particular communities, Chinese Canadians, for instance, in the minute about building the CPR. But despite this avalanche of criticism, the early heritage minutes went a long way towards achieving their nationalist aim of shaping a new Canadian mythology. By the end of the 1990s, they had entered the collective psyche because they were seen by millions of Canadians, a far larger number than had ever picked up a page-turner by Pierre Burton. Some of the catchphrases from individual minutes, such as "I smell burnt toast" from the Wilder Penfield minute, became national cliches. They spawned educational materials, heritage history fairs, classroom exercises, parodies, and drinking games. I frequently heard from teachers that these bite-sized chunks of heritage constituted a large percentage of students' high school history education. So the minutes not only fulfilled Charles Bronfman's original intent to inject some pizzazz into the past, they also determined which particular aspects of that past were lodged in viewers' imaginations and how they should be interpreted. Moreover, they quietly became a tool of government. Soon after their launch, the Crb Foundation received a $5 million grant from the federal government under its, quote, "No Canada Better" program. The $5 million grant was made through the Canadian Unity Information Office, without any fanfare. But over the next few years, despite a change of government, Ottawa quietly became the Crb Foundation's most important financial partner in this project to promote a kaleidoscope of heartwarming Canadian imagery. But the minute's role in promoting national unity came under fire when Norman Lester, an investigative reporter with Radio Canada, charged that they were subversive federal propaganda designed to undermine the Quebec sovereignty movement. When Radio Canada refused to broadcast his story, he created an uproar by releasing it to other Montreal media. In 1999, a new Bronfman-led organization called Historica Canada took over the minutes, which were renamed Historica Minutes. They went on hiatus in the early years of this century when federal funding dried up and the unity crisis subsided. In 2012, the program began again because the Stephen Harper government commissioned 2 minutes. Once again, on-screen history was being used to shape national consciousness. 2 of the new minutes were about the War of 1812, an event that the Conservative government had chosen to spotlight as part of its campaign to rebrand Canada as a warrior nation. However, both these minutes featured groups that had often been left on the sidelines. One featured an all-black regiment founded by a former slave, and the second focused on a crucial battle won almost single-handed by a small band of Indigenous warriors. Since then, Historica has made 2 minutes a year, funded by Ottawa. One recent minute about Kenowak Ashuak, the world-renowned Inuit artist who is almost unknown here, was also released in Inuktitut. Last year, new Historica minutes about the Vietnamese boat people and about Viola Desmond, now on our currency, or soon to be on our currency, each had 1.2 million views across social media and YouTube last year. These are huge numbers. Another recent minute featured Cheney Wenjack, the 11-year-old Indigenous boy who perished while on the run from a residential school in 1966. The Wenjack Minute has been viewed over 700,000 times. So the Heritage Minutes continue to be a rich source of history education. But the early batch was deliberately designed to reinforce a vision of Canada as a country built by, it turned out, mainly white heroes who created an ethnically diverse, bilingual nation with liberal values. And until recently, the producers steered clear of open wounds and rarely challenged assumptions. And even though today's minutes reflect today's Canada, subjects rarely break new ground. The Cheney Wenjack Minute was released after Canadians had already been shocked out of their collective ignorance about residential schools by the hearings and report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the late 1990s, the Heritage Minutes were followed by another well-funded attempt to put history on screen in order to promote a shared knowledge of the Canadian past and reshape national consciousness. Canada, A People's History, a 17-episode, 32-hour documentary series aired on CBC television between October 2000 to November 2001. Costing over $25 million, it was promoted as, quote, Canada's journey from past to present, and widely described as an epic. Production of the series lasted longer than the First World War, involved a team of more than 150 people, and took viewers from the frozen Arctic to Bay Street boardrooms. An unusual collaboration between the English and French arms of the state broadcaster. It was told in both official languages, like the Heritage Minutes, so that viewers on both sides of the language divide would see the same story. But unlike Heritage Minutes, this series integrated different episodes into a single unifying narrative thread, tracing Canada's development from 15,000 years ago to the year 1990. The idea of a Canadian history series had been floating around the CBC for years, but it was the near breakup of the country in 1995 that gave the idea traction. Executive producer Mark Starowitz, a 45-year veteran of the CBC until his retirement last year, described its origins in his memoir, Making History, the remarkable story behind Canada, A People's History. On the night of October the 30th, 1995, Starowitz was in Montreal anxiously watching the vote count for the second Quebec referendum on independence. In the wake of the terrifyingly narrow Federalist victory, he drafted a memorandum to his CBC bosses. He urged them to consider a documentary series on, quote, the exciting and dramatic evolution of the country, so that at a time when Canada appeared adrift and politically balkanized, his fellow citizens could understand what they risked losing. Once again, the theme of national unity was part of the initiative's DNA. True to the requirements of television history, Starowitz promised in his memo, quote, this is not intended to be didactic. The series would be, quote, vibrant, story-driven, and exciting. Within the series, every name, every line from a letter, every scene would be impeccably accurate. It would begin with the history of the Aboriginal people and end with the 1980s. We're certain we can make this a must-see event. Academic credibility was recognized as crucial. Jean Allen, director of research on the series, assembled an all-star cast of historians as advisors. The dominant themes would be the Aboriginal story, the French-English dynamic, emergence of regional class, ethnic and gender differences, Canada-United States tensions. However, the choice of advisors reflected the current explosion of social history within universities. Jean Allen's team included Dr. Ramsey Cook, by then co-editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, Jean-Claude Robert from the Université du Québec à Montréal, once again, he'd worked on the Heritage Minutes, Labour historian Dr. Greg Keeley, Dr. Veronica Strongbow, a specialist in women's history, prairie historian Gerald Friesen, and Olive Dickerson, author of the most important history of North America's First Nations. Ramsay Cook saw the larger usefulness of the series, given the widespread ignorance of Canadian history. He told Starowitz, quote, "An electorate that has no context for its decisions will make the wrong ones." However, it was the producers, rather than the academics, who decided how the narrative would be constructed. The pantheon of academic advisors ensured historical accuracy, but those were the details. Selection of the events and individuals that would be featured and interpretation of unfolding events was much more controversial. How much space for New France? How to balance maritime history against Western history? The focus throughout would be lived experience, and the series would rely heavily on the eyewitness accounts of individuals who lived through the events. Starowitz promised that the program would, quote, "illustrate contradictory perspectives of the same events and try to leave the viewer with an understanding of why people felt and acted as they did in their time and place." This was straightforward, old-fashioned storytelling, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a specially commissioned symphonic musical score. There would be nothing of the historiographical debates that had animated historians for the previous 40 years. Battles and suffering are so much more memorable than constitutional or intellectual discussions. How was Canada, a people's history, received? Reviews in the English language popular press were, for the most part, very positive, although they focused on the size of the audience rather than the content. In Quebec, reaction took a different form. Most French language media ignored the series, or like Le Devoir's television program, shrugged off the series as federalist propaganda. Academic historians' reviews ranged from unenthusiastic to unfriendly. In the Canadian Historical Review, Jane Arrington complained that the imposed nationalist narrative ignored the innovation of contemporary scholarly history, stripped Canadian history of controversy, and silenced, quote, "the cacophony of diverse voices in the narrative." Lyle Dick, then West Coast historian for Parks Canada, commented that the series reflected a view that, quote, "the development of the nation-state was the key and indispensable event in the great sweep of Canadian history." In an article entitled "Saving the Nation Through National History, the Case of Canada, a People's History," Dick argued that the series was part of a concerted effort to buttress national unity in the years after the greatest political challenge since Confederation, the Quebec referendum of 1995. He observed, "Thematically, the authors of Canada, a People's History placed a premium on finding and reinforcing unity in history." And he pointed out that the first season was plotted as an inexorable progress towards Confederation in 1867. The episodes in the second season, which covered the 123 years after Confederation, accorded heroic roles to individuals such as Pierre Trudeau, who promoted national unity, usually in the face of adversaries, Quebec nationalists, American expansionists, eager to disrupt the country. Dick pointed out that where the experience of minorities, such as First Nations, the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, did not reinforce the image of harmony, they were largely omitted from the narrative. But the academics' distaste for old-fashioned narrative history, told from a conventional perspective, was a dramatic contrast to the popular reception of the series. Polling had continued to show that most of us were clueless about this country's past. The most common reaction to most episodes was, "Gee, I didn't know that." And the audience numbers were huge. 2.5 million Canadians watched the first, much hyped, 2-hour episode of Canada, a People's History on the first day of broadcast. The average audience size for the Radio Canada version was a healthy 364,000, although it had received little promotion in Quebec. Canadian history suddenly rivaled the Stanley Cup playoffs for audience size. The series spawned T-shirts, mugs, and a 2-volume book on Canadian history that summarized the script's plot lines. Starowitz felt vindicated. He tells several interviewers, "The myth that Canadians are not interested in their history is dead. It's like we've been drilling for gas and struck some giant pent-up pressure dome that blew us away." Jean Allen, the research director for the series, who's now a professor in Ryerson University's journalism faculty, deplored, quote, "the wide gulf between popular success and professional skepticism." But a handful of historians did acknowledge that audience enthusiasm was an important achievement. As Professor Irving Abella from York University observed in a lengthy article in the Globe and Mail midway through the first series in 2001, quote, "threatened by internal disunity, racial strife, regional breakdown, and menacing globalization, Canadians are desperate for answers and explanations. A people's history has restored our history to us with all its vibrancy, surprises, and humanity." The nationalist agenda in the series was clear. A people's history told a story of a people who, with fortitude and ingenuity, accomplished great things. The message was, there had been conflicts in the past, but we surmounted them then, and despite the national unity crisis, we can do so now because there has always been a willingness here to work together. Incidentally, A People's History also anticipated an important trend in popular history, the trend towards encouraging viewers to feel that they were part of the story. Starowitz noted that descendants of diverse groups, including French fur traders, English emigres, Mennonite farmers, Jewish garment groups, all enjoyed seeing their family histories woven into the national tapestry. But one characteristic of history on screen is that it is highly ephemeral. Most viewers will watch any series only once, be it a history series or House of Cards. And in the face of new global realities, Canadians were already moving on. Fears of Quebec separatism diminished as anxieties about Islamist extremists rose. Moreover, the television landscape was changing dramatically. Within today's multi-channel universe, viewers were soon more interested in the next Netflix hit. Both the nation-building theme of Canada, A People's History, and the top technology were dated within a few years of its production. Boxed sets of the DVDs were soon abandoned on library and school shelves. But Canadians' ignorance of the past and uncertainty about a national identity persisted. And now here we are in 2017. There has been a scramble to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Confederation on screen, with programs on both public and private channels, and plenty of video available on websites and YouTube. However, not many Canada 150 events have had much to do with the past. Few of the projects have explored the evolution of Canada, from a handful of fragile British colonies in 1867 to the prosperous country we live in today. History was one of the themes selected by the Conservative government in 2015 to qualify projects for sesquicentennial federal funding, but in 2016, the new Liberal government announced a new set of themes: diversity and inclusion, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, youth, and the environment. History had been cancelled. The preferred themes match the rhetoric of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who identified Canada as, quote, the first post-national state in a New York Times interview soon after his election. He went on to say, there is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. Yet our present has been shaped by our past, and our values are rooted in Canadian history. It is our history, after all, that makes this country unique. Perhaps this post-national state of mind accounts for the CBC's decision not to broadcast an updated version of Canada, A People's History, with its building a country interpretation of the past. Starowitz and others had lobbied for this, but the proposal was turned down. The national broadcaster did make 2 more episodes of the series, which were aired last June and covered events that occurred between its original ending of 1990 and today. But both episodes continued the original series approach, the interweaving of different threads into a shared citizenship. I quote from the concluding statement of one of the episodes, quote, "We recognize the fragility of freedom as we search to find a uniquely Canadian common ground." Instead, last spring, the CBC showed a different series. Oops, thank you, Dennis.
We are explorers, risk-takers, and dreamers. Finding odds in a land of extremes. Across the vast continent, we build a nation. True, strong, and free.
The 10-part documentary drama series entitled Canada, The Story of Us was made by Bristow Global Media Inc., a Toronto-based content creation company specializing in creating multi-platform content across genres, which had been founded by Julie Bristow, who had spent 20 years at the CBC. This 2017 series was based on a format created by the London-based television company Newtopia, which had already developed America, The Story of Us, and Australia, The Story of Us. The franchised format consisted of 10-hour-long episodes, each presenting 5 first-person stories. However, the Canadian version was the first version produced for a public broadcaster. Some of the promotion material for the Canadian version has echoes of a people's history. It promised a meta-narrative in which viewers would learn about the extraordinary moments and people that, quote, helped forge a nation. And as seems inevitable in any screen treatment of Canada, there were stunning images of wildlife and dramatic scenery, plus a soaring symphonic soundtrack. And there were 2 primary historical consultants to lend academic credibility to the series: historian Dr. John English, Professor Emeritus at the University of Waterloo, biographer of Pierre Trudeau and former Liberal MP, and Indigenous arts scholar Gerald McMaster from OCAD University. Both appeared on screen, along with brief appearances by other acknowledged historians such as Dr. Margaret Macmillan of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and Dr. Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum. However, The Story of Us was a startling contrast to the earlier series in several different ways. Significantly, it was produced in English only. Starowitz's concern that viewers in both English and French Canada would watch the same story was apparently not a priority for the national broadcaster in 2017. The creation of the Federation of Two Peoples in 1867 is no longer presented as the defining moment in Canada's evolution. In fact, in episode 5, that covers the years 1858 to 1899, the political achievement of Confederation takes less than a couple of minutes, and the only father of Confederation mentioned is John A. Macdonald. Instead, the 2 most dominant features in this episode are the Plains Cree chief, Mr. Hayu Muskwa, or Big Bear, who tried to secure better land terms for his people, and John Ware, the African-American cowboy who helped create Alberta's ranching industry. As Julie Bristow said to me, we looked for less-known stories. 2/3 of the ones we used highlighted underrepresented groups, particularly women and Indigenous peoples. It was also faster paced than the people's history. Eager to reach the digitally sophisticated video game generation watching on laptops, the producers lent heavily on computer-generated special effects, handheld cameras, and quick cuts. There were more interactive opportunities with audience members, including Facebook posts and discussions. And the cost per hour of the series was considerably lower than that of A People's History. But perhaps the most dramatic contrast between The Story of Us and both the Heritage Minutes and A People's History is the former's choice for talking heads. I mentioned at the start of this afternoon's remarks that it's a challenge to find a single representative voice of authority in this country. The Story of Us went for quantity. and an approach that narrowed the gap between today's viewers and what they watched on screen. The series included commentary from more than 80 prominent Canadians, most of whom had little or no connection to history. They included singer Susan Aglukak, actors Lorne Cardinal, Paul Gross, Christopher Plummer, Eugene Levy, and Tatiana Maslany, broadcasters Duncan McHugh and David Suzuki, television producer Clement Virgo, YouTuber Lily Singh, mixed martial arts star George St. Pierre, entrepreneur Jim Balsillie, explorer Wade Davis. At times, as I watched it, it seemed that only Drake and Inspector Gadget were missing. The celebrities often seemed coached in what they were to say. Montreal novelist Kim Thuy, who arrived here as a refugee from Vietnam in the early 1970s, talked about Canadian nurses in the First World War, as well as about the arrival of Vietnamese refugees. Cameron Bailey, the London-born African-Canadian who is former director of the Toronto International Film Festival, explained the crucial role played by black soldiers in the War of 1812. In every episode, an Indigenous Canadian, Hayden King, Roberta Jameson, Eldon Yellowhorn, Candy Parmenter among them, commented on the section that featured an Indigenous story. Bristow explains, quote, "We wanted to modernize the story and engage the widest possible audience. We looked for influencers who the viewers would know. We wanted to get away from white male history professors." This model encourages viewers to be drawn into a relationship with their nation's heritage rather than remaining a passive audience. But is this history? The audience for the first screened episode of Canada, The Story of Us, was 900,000, larger than for most documentary series. The popular reaction was, as with Heritage Minutes and A People's History, the oft-repeated sentence, "I didn't know that." And audience figures remained around 500,000 for subsequent episodes. One appreciative parent whose tri-generational family had enjoyed the series together wrote to the Globe, quote, "It made us question and think and feel something about Canadian history." Judging by such reactions and comments that I've heard at various events and book clubs, Canada, The Story of Us achieved the history on-screen goal of triggering excitement and empathy among casual viewers. But many history scholars were outraged by its radical recasting of the Canadian past and the omission of events hitherto regarded as crucial to this country's development. University historians complained the series was an exclusively Anglo-Canadian production which omitted Acadians, rendered Francophones invisible, and ignored the French-English relationship. For Quebec university-based historians complained that the series was one-sided and biased. They particularly objected to the way that Champlain was depicted as unkempt and badly dressed, while they claimed that James Wolfe didn't have a hair out of place after scaling the heights of Abraham. This left the impression, the historians charged that the French were, quote, "vicious, dirty, and treacherous," while the civilizing power of the English came from, quote, "their reason and superior morals." The series' deliberate disregard for Canada's political underpinnings exasperated other scholars. Professor Norman Hilmer of Carleton University observes that Mackenzie King was 20th century Canada's most successful and important political leader who had a clear vision of the country grounded in national unity. Many of his compromises and achievements define modern Canada. However, points out Dr. Hilmer, The Story of Us, quote, "does not pause even to mention King's name in its tales of the relentless smiting of the status quo as we become the diverse and progressive folk Canadians now imagine themselves to be." But at the same time, Hilmer is dismayed at historians' abandonment, quote, "of the study of the political framework that shapes so much of what we were and what we are." He impresses on his own students that Canada did not result from some burst of patriotic sentiment, but rather from the politics of knowing that we were better off together than apart. Once again, one must ask, what was the message about Canadian history and identity for the 500,000 viewers who stayed loyal to the English-only series through all 10 episodes. Like its predecessor, the story of us imparts an upbeat message that is close to nationalist propaganda. In the final episode, the narrator proclaims, quote, "Against all odds and despite its vast dimensions, harsh landscape, and modest population, Canada has grown strong. Nation builders in 2017 are people like Zaka Nawaz, creator of Little Mosque on the Prairie." But this time, the message captured those themes laid out by the Trudeau government for the 2017 sesquicentennial: diversity and inclusion, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, youth, and the environment. These themes had replaced the traditional historical narrative of the uneasy accommodation between the two founding peoples, with national unity as a key driver and confederation as a key event. Instead, viewers absorbed the idea that there was no mainstream identity, but there are many sunny qualities and common values. As CBC newsman Peter Mansbridge asserted in one episode, quote, "A Canadian is someone who cares," or as actor Combe Fior said elsewhere, "We embrace service." BGM principal Julie Bristow and executive producer Marlo Miazga described to me the message about identity that they wanted to leave with their viewers. Quote, "Canada has become an experiment, a petri dish for the world to watch and study. We cannot yet call it a success, but we certainly have something unique in this country with our drive towards a tolerant, multicultural society. Although sometimes flawed, the world is watching with hope." So once again, our past is being rewritten for the next generation, and the new version reflects contemporary political priorities. There is nothing new here. Is a popular history series a dangerous distortion if it omits most prime ministers, downplays crucial constitutional events, and ignores 1/4 of the country's population because their first language is not English? Or were previous series that largely ignored Indigenous, social, and immigrant history equally misshapen? Many of those of us who participated in the story of us did so because we thought that history matters. As my fellow participant Mark Kingwell, a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, wrote in the Globe, "These days in Canada, there seems to be, quote, a presumption that you shouldn't say anything if you can't embrace the totality of the Canadian experience. But in our post-nation state, there is no such thing as the totality of Canadian experience. And Canadians are curious about our history. So we live in a fragmented country defined by changing relative values and a population that is more diverse every year. But the gulf between the way that scholars and filmmakers present Canadian history has never been wider. On screen, history is all about national narratives for this evolving national audience in search of a collective Canadian identity. Inevitably, this means attempting to integrate different stories into one coherent picture. Filmmakers can never cover everything, so they pick the episodes that have visual and emotional appeal and resonate with as large an audience as possible. Although the Globe's television critic John Doyle disparaged Canada, the story of us as, quote, popular, lightweight, illustrated history, audience figures suggest that viewers enjoyed what he dismissed as, quote, an adventure story. But few university-based historians in Canada are interested in stepping outside their institutions, now saturated in postmodernism, and either telling a good story or looking at the big picture of the Canadian past. Canadian history is in decline in our universities. Student enrollment is dropping, faculties are shrinking, new appointments are rarely Canadian specialists. Scholars who do specialize in Canadian history are often more interested in researching the histories, plural, of groups within the population than in writing national histories for general readers. And perhaps that is why Canadians learned little about Confederation, essentially a political contract, in our Confederation sesquicentennial. Perhaps the current government decided that our history is simply too divisive, so it's better to ignore it, rather than explore the achievements and failures of the past century and a half. But I don't think it says much for the maturity of this country if we prefer to ignore difficult questions, detach our present from the past, and reinforce the gulf between the elite, in this case cultural commentators and university-based historians, and citizens happy to acquire at least a smattering of historical knowledge by watching adventure stories. Let's face it, watching any version of Canadian history on television may be the only Canadian history most citizens will ever learn. Thank you.